Monetary policy in action when the Fed does what? So there are some factors that shape Fed policy that help them decide what they need to do. One is the neutral real interest rate. That is a special interest rate that exists when the economy is in neutral at its potential. And so that's a target that the Fed uses to guide its policies. We also have the nominal interest rate, which is the current interest rate, and the one that the Fed controls is called the federal funds rate. And with that rate, the Federal Reserve influences the other interest rate and the real interest rate. So nominal, remember, is real plus inflation, right? And the federal fund rate is a special interest rate, the one at which banks borrow money from each other. Another thing that the Fed looks at is the difference between the actual inflation and the target inflation, what they want the inflation to be, and it's usually about 2%. And they also look at the output gap, the difference between the actual and potential output. And putting all these things together gives them a target that guides their policies. In general, if the demand is below the economy's capacity to produce, meaning if we have a negative output gap, then the Federal Reserve policy will attempt to stimulate the economy to make it grow again. If, however, the demand is above the economy's capacity to produce and inflation is now a problem, that would be inflation being above target and having an output gap that is positive, then the Federal Reserve's policy will attempt to restrain the economy and reduce the demand for goods and services. So if overall demand is below the capacity of the economy to produce, and it means that firms are producing less, and the problem that arises from this is unemployment. And so what should the Fed do? So they would lower the interest on reserve and on the overnight reverse repurchases. And this will encourage the banks and other financial institutions to use their reserves and lend to other banks and to the public, because they will earn less by keeping their reserve at the Fed and getting interest on it. They have better opportunities in lending to the public and to other banks. So if more reserves are available for lending, the Federal Reserve rate will fall. And that means that other interest rate will fall as well. And so it will make borrowing cheaper, investment will be less costly, and this is likely to increase production and output. On the other side, if the overall demand in the economy is above the capacity of the economy to produce, meaning we would have a positive output gap, wages and other prices are increasing, and so you get an inflation problem. Inflation is now above target. In this case, what should the Fed do? Well, in this case, they need to raise the interest on reserves and overnight reverse repurchases. That will encourage banks to keep their reserve at the Fed and earn the interest and do less lending to other banks and the public. If there are less reserves available for lending, then the interest on money, on loans, is going to increase. So the federal fund rate will increase. Borrowing becomes more expensive, and that discourages investment, and production increases or slowed down, and we reach more sustainable growth level. So this applies also if the inflation is above target. All right, so if we put all of these different things together, all these different factors, we get to what we call the Fed's rule of thumb. This is how they aggregate all this information and come up with a target for their federal fund rate, what it should be currently to achieve the best possible economic outcome. Right, so the real interest rate is equal to that neutral interest rate plus adjustment for deviation from inflation and output target. So in other words, you take the federal fund rate minus inflation. It's equal to the neutral interest rate plus half of the deviation of from inflation from the target, which is at 2%, and the output gap. Right? So they aggregate all this, and then they come up with a number. Right, so let's look at an example. All right, so here's the situation. You have the neutral rate is at 0.5. This is what the Fed has determined to be the neutral interest rate. We have currently inflation is 4, output gap is 1. Right, so the inflation here is above target. We have a positive output gap, which means that the economy is above its potential, right? So let's see what number we come up with. So the federal fund rate minus inflation is equal to the neutral interest rate plus half of the inflation gap, we can call it that. So 4% minus 2% plus 1%, which is our output gap, and that gives us 2.5. Now, the inflation we know is 4%. So we can calculate now the federal fund rate being 2.5 plus the inflation, 6.5, right? So this is probably meaning that the federal fund rate has to be increased in this case to reduce the output gap and to lower the inflation. All right, here is the summary of this portion of monetary policy in action.